Yes, I am from Finland, of course, from Helsinki actually, and I have actually studied at the University of Helsinki. I have a master's in organic chemistry and biochemistry far back, and also sociology. So I have been here and I feel very connected, but I have never been to Vik because that came after my time. So yes, as Heikki was mentioning, I actually have spent a lot of time studying biologists. I have turned into a sociologist of science because I am very interested in how scientists think and reason, both about epistemology and methodology and also about metaphysical issues. And it's of course hard to get to that, but because I'm a sociologist, I can get to interview people. And somehow they tell me lots of things, which is so nice. And then I sort them out and analyze them and then produce books. And I hope they like what I say. Well, my book, Defenders of the Truth, is a somewhat sneering title of everybody who was involved in the big conflict about sociobiology, which happened around 1975, and I would say is still going on today, and that is what I'm going to talk about. A biography about Bill Hamilton is a biography about the person who started, we could say, the sociobiological revolution in the 1960s, but it became really a big thing in the 70s. Let me go back to the beginning. We could talk about a paradigm shift really in the thinking in evolutionary biology. Of course, I'm not talking about paradigm shift in a very huge sense like Thomas Kuhn, but as to the way to think about the world. And I see that Hanna, for instance, is thinking in terms of the ways that people think today. But in the early 60s still, and maybe continuing to the early 70s, evolutionary biologists were thinking in terms of group selection, which was not modeled in any particular way. It was just a statement because it looked kind of, I think, ideologically appealing and maybe also true in many senses that animals and people sacrifice themselves or are willing to help total strangers. So there is a kind of feeling that you are part of a bigger group, you are part of a bigger species, and you do this. And you know there were lots of cases from the World War, for instance, where you knew that soldiers threw themselves on grenades to save their friends, and so on. And one knows, everybody knew cases from the animal world where you have alarm calls that are saving other animals, but the animal that lets out the alarm calls would die at the same time. So these were somewhat mysterious, but nobody really put his or her finger very strongly on it or made a mathematical analysis. Now, with the help of neo-Darwinism and population genetics, it was possible really to develop models now and try to formalize it. And the one who did that was Bill Hamilton, William Donald Hamilton, in his very famous paper, which just turned 50 years last year. It was a paper published in Theoretical Biology 1964, which was called The Evolution of Social Behavior, where he was trying to formalize the typical types of social behavior in a mathematical way. So he discussed cooperation, selfishness, altruism, and something that he, in his manuscript, called stupid, but later on called spite. Spite is a behavior that doesn't benefit you, but benefits somebody else even less. So you harm somebody and you feel good about it, okay, even if you suffer a little. Okay. Today, I know that there is a lot of studies about that, but Hamilton himself believed that that was very unusual, or maybe not even existing. But what his particular the behavior that he particularly studied was altruism, and the behavior he became famous for because he solved one of Darwin's riddles this way. How is altruistic behavior possible? Because the animal dies. And of course, his big contribution was to put a different spin on the whole thing and look at the whole thing from the gene's eyes point of view, that it is not the animal organism, the individual organism that should survive, but it is actually the genes. And the genes may exist here and there, in offspring, in cousins, in uncles, whatever. And also in other animals that are not formally related, but somehow share particular kinds of genes, meaning that this particular hypothetical altruistic gene. So he developed, he was very taken with R.A. Fisher as one of these geniuses of the so-called evolutionary synthesis of the 1930s. And it was Fisher, actually, who brought together mathematically Mendelism and Darwinism. These were two schools that had been fighting with each other for a long time. And he actually said the following: there is no problem with mutations. Mutations are not opposed to the Darwinian gradualism. Because if you look at small mutations, then that is very good, because very natural selection needs variation to work. And we get the variation from having a lot of small mutations. Okay, so this way he united this in a brilliant way and solved the problem. And young Bill Hamilton, who was a student at Cambridge University, was very taken with this. He found a book in the library, and his teachers forbade him almost to read it. He said, "No reading of Fisher. He's a group selection. Don't read this. This is not. Fisher doesn't know anything." And they were trying to tell him about group selection and stuff. And of course, he got even more keen to read Fisher because he was a very naughty young man. And then he decided to formalize this in some way. Okay, so everybody seems to have resisted him at the time because they thought that everything was fine with group selection. Why start dealing with altruism, and why start dealing with genes and humans at the same time? This was not a good time. It was after the Second World War. There had been a lot of racial superiority, conflict between nations, all kinds of bad things had been said. Nobody wanted it. But he persisted because he was extremely stubborn, which is a very good feature in a scientist. Remember this. Okay, so what was the paradigm shift then that happened? The paradigm shift was that because of Hamilton's contribution, which was getting more discovered in the 70s, it was realized that actually you can do some work in evolutionary biology now when you have these formulas. And Hamilton had a very handy formula, which was called Hamilton's rules, which said more or less that if the benefit of an altruistic act falls on some individual which is genetically related to the donor, then this evolution will favor the evolution of altruism. Okay, and he showed it in a very simple formula. And people jumped on this and started opening up fantastic industries, and they are going on today, and they are very lucrative, and they are very good, and they also generate lots of new ideas. So this is one of those very happy, very important discoveries, so to say, or formulations in, shall we say, scientific history. But what happened to group selection? Well, there was a group of people, a group of scientists who had actually become irritated with group selection because it was not possible to formulate it very well. And they said, actually, it also sounds wrong. And then when Hamilton's idea of this, okay, I must first explain what actually it is called. Hamilton's idea was actually something called inclusive fitness. It was a broadening of the idea of fitness in general to also involving all the individuals with whom an individual is relating. because you are not living alone, so you are helping some other individuals, they are helping you, or they maybe harm you and you harm them, or whatever. But hypothetically, if you summarize all the actions and you count plus and minuses and some kind of quantitatively maybe the impact, hypothetically, then you get something called inclusive fitness. So this was a hypothetical clarification of the laws of natural selection, how they actually work. But of course, this was very hypothetical. So the rule, the formula was this Hamilton's rule, which was being used. And then you had John Maynard Smith, a very brilliant man who was extremely good at picking up ideas and kind of packaging them in such a way that people actually understood what they mean, which is a great skill in science too. So he had been looking for something to beat this group selection idea with, which he thought was unsound. He was many of these biologists are very passionate biologists, and that is what makes them so much fun. Unfortunately, these two people are already dead, and they die, after one after another. I will get to some people who are not dead, and they are kicking. Okay, that's later. So this John Maynard Smith invented a term for the thing that Hamilton had discovered, which is that it should involve some genes in common, and then in this way you can explain why it's possible. And he called that kin selection. So that is a very catchy term and intuitively clear, but it also had the bad side of that, was that people started thinking that it only had to do with relatives, okay? And that easily becomes it easily conjures up in people's minds the idea that relatives should stick together and hold hands and, just support each other and not care about anybody else. So it had that kind of potentially negative consequence, but it was a very good term, and it is now used. Nobody talks about inclusive fitness because it's a little clumsy, and it should not really be calculated. It's a principle, but people talk about kin selection. Okay, so in the middle of, by the way, in my book, Nature's Oracle, about Hamilton, I have explained at length, and I follow the theme through the book, how Hamilton was extremely angry with John Maynard Smith because he believed that John Maynard Smith had actually stolen his priority. And I have presented letters and stuff, and the reader can judge for themselves what actually happened. I think that Hamilton has some point there, but maybe not as big as he thinks. Okay. So in the middle of the 70s then, it became obvious to the evolutionary the world of evolutionary biology that actually something was going on, and there was something exciting coming up. And many people started writing books summarizing this. You probably haven't heard about other books than E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, and Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, because those are the most famous of those books, and they actually stole the show totally from the other books. Wilson's was 75 and Dawkins was 76. And now comes a rather interesting point, which is that Wilson, of course, coined the term sociobiology. I mean, he actually revived a term that existed in biological circles, but those were small. And he wrote this huge book, maybe 2 kilos or something like that, or more, I don't know, very heavy. And it contained so many different things, that it was not really clear what he wanted to emphasize there. He had he had a first chapter talking about the gene, so maybe some people thought that he was like Dawkins, who knows. He had a last chapter talking about humans. That got him really in trouble. The rest was filled with animal stories and various kinds of discoveries, and was a very, very good compendium for many people who like biology. But the interesting thing is that what Wilson himself presented as his kind of vision for what a good sociobiology would be, which was almost like a hypothetical formula that included lots of population parameters and this and that. He wanted all kinds of things in and churn it out into some kind of vision of sociobiology. And that has never been used by anybody, as far as I know. But what Richard Dawkins did in his Selfish Gene, it had nothing to do with selfishness, which another misunderstanding. So people take the selfish gene. I remember I visited England around the time when it came out, and a brother of one of my old friends there pointed to it on his bookshelf and said, "That's the way it is." And I said to myself, "You don't know anything about biology. Why do you say that is what it is?" "Oh, he thinks that's the way life is. Oh my God." And so even in England, or not even, maybe exactly in England, people thought that because it was a Thatcher era, then it was a Reagan era in America, and the selfish gene took on this kind of connotation. Okay. Now, but the content of the selfish gene was exactly on target as to what are the important theories. And those are the theories that actually have been used in sociobiological research. Okay, as we'll just get to them. By the way, everybody hated the word sociobiology because it got a very bad name with the so-called sociobiology controversy, which I will also get to. So which are these important theories in sociobiology? It's Hamilton's idea about inclusive fitness. It is George Williams. George Williams was 10 years older than Hamilton, an American, but they had a very kind of close relationship. George Williams was supporting this idea that you should not invoke any group selection unless, if you can explain something at the individual or genetic level. So he wrote a very influential book that kind of absolved biologists from having to consider group selection and instead go with these new formulas that were very handy. Then you had Robert Trivers, who said, yes, well, this kin selection is a good idea. Of course, relatives may be involved, but what about individuals that are not related? And he said, well, I have a principle for them that's called reciprocity. He called it reciprocal altruism, but that was maybe overkill because it was not really altruism, it was exchange. So we had these two principles already, kin selection and reciprocal altruism. And then John Maynard Smith came in with some game theoretic theories and so on. So game theory opened up and it became a very, very big business. Now, what happened when Wilson's book came out? There was a real, almost audible scream at Harvard at the time, because it seemed to two of his colleagues who were extremely alert to social injustice. They were trained, they were self-studied Marxists and left-wing liberals, and they were very upset that anybody would write a book which would address humans, which was really the last chapter of Wilson's book, in such a way that you would talk about human behavior as, of course, involving, or most likely involving, deep biological basis. Because at the time, what was the climate what was the social climate, the academic climate? In the middle of the 70s, the academic climate was still totally, shall we call, environmentalist, but not in the sense of the environmentalist today. So let's call it culturist. You had behaviorism, which has to do with learned behavior, conditioned reflexes and stuff like that. Very, very influential paradigm still in psychology, still reigning. You have Margaret Mead in anthropology, very influential paradigm about cultures being different and us, so to say, respecting the fact that cultural behavior can be very, very varied, and we have these different cultures. So here comes Wilson and says, all humans have some kind of basis in biology, and human behavior is kind of founded on biology. And then he likes to provoke people. So he said, and what about things like morals? Yeah, morals too has a biological base. What about religion? Yes, religion too. People were going crazy about this. But actually they were getting even angrier when he said that sex roles may have a biological basis. This is what he was really hated for by the left. And what happened was, and I can report because I was there, the famous meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Washington, D.C., 1978. Wilson was there, supposedly in a panel, which also contained Stephen Jay Gould, who was rather well behaved, and some other people, and it was supposed to be a discussion about sociobiology. So it was a double ballroom full of people. You can imagine, because it was a very big thing already going on. And at this point, there was a group from the audience that suddenly materialized. I see now people materializing here, but they kind of suddenly came up and they rushed up with various banners, which they must have had on the floor. It was very well organized. And they said things like, "Wilson, you are all wet." And at first they said something about genocide or something, and then they grabbed a big pitcher of ice water, I see no such thing here, and poured it down his neck. Okay. And they said, "Wilson, you are all wet." And of course that was true. Okay. And Wilson held up extremely well. And this became a very big thing in the newspapers. And this kind of started, I think, the sale of his book, or something like that. Well, so that is, so if I must say that science is not boring at all, as far as I can tell, and I have a lot of fun studying scientists, because we have very dramatic events here. Remember that the people who attacked him first were biologists, his own colleagues. Okay, and they did it in the name of the fear they saw of invoking again biology, because it had done so much harm, they thought, in earlier periods. Okay, now Wilson himself, what was his motives? Was he the evil fascist, racist that they labeled him? No, actually, Wilson thought that, he told me at least, he said that I think that the culture, emphasis on culture is like too much, and we should also bring in the fact that there are, for instance, I think that he was maybe steeped in some kind of Freudian belief. Sigmund Freud was also very popular at the time, and he was getting irritated with this idea that parents are being blamed for how they treat their children when they are young, and that is like the parents' fault that the children don't come out well. So he said that there are personalities, and we have to recognize biological factors, otherwise everything is getting out of hand. That was one of his arguments. But in general, I think that he wanted to tell the truth in some way, and not leave everything to people who know cultures, because he was looking for some deeper factors. And actually, I think he was looking for unifying humankind, because he's basically a good man. But he did exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time from the point of view of the left. Okay. This paradigm shift, by the way, was so big that it became a personal experience for many people. I met people because I interviewed people for my book, for my dissertation first, that was a long time ago. And they told me that they have seen the light, Yes, it's group selection, but suddenly I see how to think about this. And it was a strong experience, an emotional experience for some people, also intellectual. These things go together, I guess. And there were some conflicts between colleagues who didn't speak to each other, because one remained a group selectionist and one became a kin selectionist. So this is a rather big thing. And this group selection, kin selection tension is still there today, and I want to talk about that. Do I have time? Well, anyway, so this sociobiology controversy rolled on. Gould and Luontin started developing now alternative theories of proof that adaptation is not the only force. And of course this was very useful because that's good to have. And then later on, Tooby and Cosmides started developing evolutionary psychology as an alternative to sociobiology, because nobody wanted to hear about sociobiology. So they instead concentrated on the development of the psychology of the mind, because it didn't sound as if it had to do with genes, and so on. In 2000, many things happened. Well, one big thing happened in 2000, and that was that the genome was sequenced, okay? And so people who had been listening in on these controversies, which were, I was in America at the time, so I could see that they were popping up, all these discussions in all kinds of newspapers, not in newspapers only, but particularly in journals. There was like an intellectual discourse, so people knew about this and people took positions. But at the same time, because there was so much gene propaganda, there was exaggerated statements, like when we know the genes, we know what human beings are, and stuff like that, coming from Jim Watson and such people. So the gene suddenly became almost like acceptable, and you know, and popular journals started reporting things like, oh, there is a gene for risk taking, and there are genes for this, and people say, yeah, I must have a gene for risk taking. So it became a popular word, and therefore sociobiology didn't look so bad now if gene was like okay instead of being terrible. And also time was going on from the Second World War. We had a new generation, or many new generations. Marxism fell, Soviet Union fell, so there was not very much to push in that direction. Of course, you could push in general. Marxism remained in universities, and of course, you can always push for liberal causes, which is a good thing, I think. Dawkins started becoming an avid atheist. You know, he left kind of this field more or less. Wilson went to continued studying ants, his favorite animals, and saving the environment and stuff. Everything looked kind of calm. People started dying, though. Hamilton died in 2000. Stephen Jay Gould died in 2002, and John Maynard Smith died in 2004. The only person alive was George Williams, but he was kind of becoming more and more ill. So, bingo, what happened in 2005? Suddenly, E.O. Wilson writes an article together with his colleague Bert Höldobler, a very good insect person, also general biologist, but mostly insect person, in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, and they say, we have shown that kin selection doesn't work, and one should really use group selection for explaining. And now they talked about superorganisms, meaning social insect societies, hives, and so on. Okay, so maybe that was true for that, but Wilson wanted to generalize it. So very soon, he alone, not with Höldobler, started writing articles like kin selection is dead, kin selection doesn't work. And people were baffled, and they kind of wrote back and say, no, you have misunderstood something here. It works very well. We have all these studies, you know, and we are very happy with it because it's just a general principle, and it just works. And then in 2010, the real bomb happened, which was really interesting. In Nature, Wilson has gotten together with two mathematical modelers and churned out a kind of model which shows that you can have cooperation, not exactly altruism, but cooperation without having any genetic relationship. At least they tried to show that. This has been disputed later. They actually succeeded, but a different story. This was the aim, but the wording was rather rough. Somebody should have told them to play it down. They said things like, kin selection is like, inclusive fitness is like epicycles on epicycles, it's like Ptolemy. It doesn't go anywhere, and kin selection doesn't work, and they came with all kinds of statements. And some people said, the biologist I talked to said, like, this must not have been refereed, because these are elementary mistakes, you know, somebody should have told them. But how come it was published? And this is still a mystery. Why was it published? Okay, one can speculate about that. Anyway, what happens? This was published in Nature, and I know that there was an immediate organization of biologists to respond to this. But it wasn't published for about half a year. Very surprising. But in about half a year or more, there was a response. Very, I would say, politely worded, with full with references, patiently. It's like a textbook. It's a wonderful textbook summary of what is known and what is thought and how it works, of about 150 people. Okay, these are all the top people. I don't know, Hanna, did you sign it? Yeah, okay, Hanna also, our Hanna here, and others too. Most people who had been educated and knew about this signed it. Okay. And what was the response? The response was as if they had not very much paid attention to this. So they just stuck by their guns. So there's a very big, so there was now an obvious like declaration of war. And that one has to ask like what actually happened here. Then 2012, Wilson, who writes small books, he's getting older, so he writes smaller books now. He wrote a book called The Social Conquest of Earth. And it is about how the social insects have been extremely successful and how humans, independently of the social insects, have been extremely successful. And he describes the evolution of both, and he believes that cooperation plays an important part in each. I mean, this sounds uncontroversial so far. But in order to back up his part about humans, he refers to the Nature articles. And as I have proven in Nature 2010, you know, blah, 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 blah. You know, it's contestable. Has he really proven it? And he then describes an idea about the importance of human cooperation and how that has to do with group selection, or actually multi-level selection, because groups can be smaller groups, or it can be tribes, or it can be nations, or it can be something. And of course, group selection in Wilson's view, I mean, what is group selection? It's selection between groups, not between individuals. So one group has to exterminate somehow another group, or they have to somehow, one group has to disappear somehow. So one can see in front of oneself a bloody conflict between groups and groups and groups and groups. And one can really ask, can humans really have evolved like that? How many groups have there really been, you know, in early times, and so on? But what has happened in general, and this is interesting, Wilson is kind of at the same time as responding to a trend, which is there is an interest now in many fields, anthropology too, which is okay, we have this kind of kin selection, which has to do with relationships between people, I mean individuals who have similar genes, which are most probably individuals who live close to each other, or who are relatives, or then for some reason have similar genes, because maybe they come to the same place from various places, but they stick with this place, and that, who knows? There are various kinds of explanation of why this may be true, but it's unusual as a phenomenon. I lost myself. What did I say? The emphasis has been then on this group selection. But there have been various attempts to look at this, and I think that the best answer so far is by Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson, not Richardson. They are both at University of California, and they already in 1985 started a serious thinking about gene-culture coevolution. And they think about the fact that humans are really different in the sense that they learn to imitate, they can transmit culture, they can pick up culture from more than just their own parents, and so on and so on. And he's looking at all the richness of human and all the idea of norms and the possibility of enforcing norms, meaning that groups actually can be very strongly influenced by culture. So in a recent paper, Boyd and Richardson discuss this even more, and certainly they do it in their book 2005 called Not by Genes Alone, which is that they strongly say that culture plays a role, and they have started emphasizing culture even more. So this is fun because I'm a sociologist, and I also feel that there is something special about humans, and that should be somehow put into spin. And their argument is, for instance, this, that culture, that group selection is selection between groups, but you don't have to have a kind of extermination. You can have absorption of one group by another. You can have the group that has a better normative system, for instance, win or like be imitated by other groups and so on. There are many, many possibilities. It doesn't have to be bloody warfare. Some other people seem to like this idea of bloody warfare, and when they invoke group selection about humans, they bring in this. But so this is a very interesting question that Wilson, in his own way, is trying to address, but I think in a very clumsy way. And in a recent book, he says the following, that there is a tension between individual selection and group selection inside every being. And I think he's right here, and he said it already anyway in 1978 in his book on human nature. And he says that selfishness is sin, and sacrifice for the group is virtue. And one can see here that this reflects very strongly on his deep wish, ever since he started becoming a biologist when he was about 16 years old or so, deep wish to supplant a deep religious upbringing. He was a Southern Baptist, and he kind of gave up that one. They gave up that theory, but he kind of instead embraced natural selection. So for him, he has like a new religion in science, and I think he's trying to transform ideas from the Bible and moral ideas and make that a kind of applicable in evolutionary theory. And indeed, he believes that, and this as he has said a couple of times, he believes that evolutionary theory is the kind of theory that really would serve people very nicely instead of religion, because he thinks it's true, and he thinks that it will satisfy the need that he believes, as a biologist, that we all have for some kind of ideology, some kind of guiding light. But he says, do not listen to those theologians because they take their ideas from I don't know where. You have to take the ideas from something we know is true, which is nature, which of course is a very strong statement. And so he belongs to those biologists actually who believe that you should listen to nature very strongly. And I don't know why he's now kicking Hamilton. Hamilton is dead. It could be that he wants to be the last man standing, having said the last word, and actually he always has believed in group selection himself and so on. But now I want to end with this, and this is going to shock you. Everybody knows Richard Dawkins, or what? So, where is this now? Here. So, The Social Conquest of Earth is a book that was published in 2012, and somehow Richard Dawkins, of all people, was invited to review it. And he did. And he doesn't like the book at all, it seems. First he goes on explaining that it is very interesting about humans, but it has many mistakes about evolutionary biology. And then he says, and of course he dislikes the fact that Wilson is kind of kicking kin selection all the time when he can. So he ends like this. Edward Wilson has made important discoveries of his own. His place in history is assured, and so is Hamilton's. Please do read Wilson's earlier books, including the monumental The Ants, written jointly with Bert Huldobler. As for the book under review, that book, Social Conquest of Earth, the theoretical errors I have explained are important, pervasive, and integral to its thesis in a way that renders it impossible to recommend. To borrow from Dorothy Parker, this is not a book to be tossed lightly aside. It should be thrown with great force and sincere regret. So now you should follow these guys now. What did Wilson do as a response? He, in an interview and in some writing, called Dawkins a journalist. He said, I do not have to respond because Dawkins is not a scientist, he is a journalist. Okay, I will end here.